His tongue rotted before he became a man. That's how chroniclers described the final months of Edward VI's life. As early as 1551, the English court began to notice the teenage king was increasingly skipping meals, and his voice was becoming hollow, as if he couldn't cope with even a simple sip of water. But the roots of this tragedy go back even further, to the special upbringing provided to him by his nanny, Agnes. If you're not faint-hearted and have watched the story to the 12th minute, you've got my respect. Others would have turned it off long ago. When Edward turned 13 in January 1549, his life changed. The entire responsibility for the king's physical and moral development rested on the shoulders of a single 25-year-old girl. Agnes was considered a role model by those around her. She knew how to behave at court, understood the intricacies of court intrigue, but had her own ideas about manliness and how to build character. The memoirs of contemporaries preserved disturbing details. One of Edward's most noticeable features was his long, almost 18-centimeter long tongue, an anatomical peculiarity that inevitably attracted attention. Agnes, taking advantage of the family's absolute trust, decided that this trait was a sign of his specialness and proposed a strange game to her charge. One day she called him into her chambers, lowered her long dark skirt before him, and quietly said, "See what is hidden here, beneath the veil of secrecy." Edward complied, unaware that from that moment on, his life would cease to be a child's play. According to the records of palace servants, after that meeting, the boy walked around in silence for a day and barely ate, his gaze distant, and drool drooling from the corners of his lips. No one dared ask what had happened. In those days, invading the royal family's privacy was considered a crime. The following week, Agnes invited Edward to her place again. This time she demanded not only to look, but also to touch and smell, to taste things the young king had never experienced before. Thus, having barely reached 13, Edward became a participant in oral rituals, that very school of masculinity hidden behind the court walls. This episode remained a mystery for a long time. Chronicles of the Era note, in February 1549, the king's behavior began to change. He was plagued by nightmares, began to lose interest in games and socializing, and preferred solitude and frequent visits to his nanny's chambers. Agnes gained de facto control over the future ruler's daily routine, surroundings, and even his diet. Everything concerning his health passed through her. The servants, fearing the loss of their jobs, kept quiet about what was happening. For the royal entourage, any rumors of deviant behavior could have been a death sentence. But even then, in the spring of 1549, it was clear that something irreversible was happening to Edward. His mental state was becoming increasingly unstable, and his physical condition began to alarm the few who were aware. Chronicles would later write, "The tragedy that led to the king's death began in the year when the child had just turned 13. In the spring of 1550, the atmosphere at court grew increasingly tense. Edward VI, the teenager who was supposed to be the symbol of England's future, was changing with each passing day, but not in the way those close to him had expected. By May, he had almost completely disappeared from the public life of the palace. His place at ceremonies remained empty. His place at table was often filled by servants, and when he did appear in public, it was only for a few minutes, with a dull gaze. No one knew what was truly happening to the king. Official reports were limited to dry phrases about fatigue and adolescent changes, but those who saw Edward up close noticed increasingly alarming signs. In June 1550, servants first noticed his unusual behavior. The young man tried to avoid conversation, rarely opened his mouth, and his lips were always pressed together. He stopped smiling, even at formal receptions, when by tradition he was supposed to greet guests. His voice became quiet and hoarse, as if he were afraid someone would overhear something. Against the general restraint in the palace, these changes seemed especially striking. By August 1550, the situation had escalated. The king began avoiding his own advisors. He postponed any meetings that required his personal presence, refused to engage in conversation, and often left in the middle of gatherings without saying goodbye. Those around him noticed that Edward had become irritable, frequently waving his hand if anyone attempted to engage him in conversation. Once, when one of his servants accidentally noticed a trace of blood on his sleeve, the king abruptly pulled his hand away and flew into a fit of rage, after which he disappeared from sight for several days. The servants keeping watch outside his chambers noticed other oddities. The smell emanating from the room grew increasingly pungent, a mixture of medicine, rot, and something sickly sweet that even the scent of incense couldn't mask. The doors to Edward's chambers always remained tightly closed, and only a few trusted persons were allowed in, and then only for a few minutes. In September 1550, the head cook complained for the first time that dishes prepared for the king were being returned untouched. Edward barely ate, and if he did, he would sit for several minutes with a piece of bread in his hand, untouched. Those around him began to whisper. Some attributed the situation to overwork, others blamed secret illnesses, and still others, dark forces and family curses. However, no one dared to speak openly about what was happening. Silence always reigned in the royal family, especially when it came to the monarch's health. Any word contrary to the official version could cost a career, and sometimes even their life. During this period, Edward's behavior among people became even more withdrawn. When meeting noble guests, he tried to keep his distance, barely making eye contact, often turning away and covering his mouth with his hand, as if afraid someone would notice his problem. A correspondence with the Bishop of York, dated November of 1550, states, "The young sovereign seemed detached, answered questions inappropriately. His gaze was clouded, and his hands trembled so much that the ink blotted the paper." The physical manifestations of the illness became increasingly evident. Edward's tongue began to swell, painful ulcers appeared on its surface, and strange gray spots appeared along its edges. A heavy, suffocating odor emanated from his mouth. The king increasingly held a piece of cloth in his mouth to mask the stench and prevent saliva from dripping down his chin. Even his closest confidants tried not to linger in his company for more than a few minutes, citing urgent matters. In the winter of 1551, tensions flared again. During one official reception, Edward, barely beginning to speak, became hoarse and, without finishing his sentence, hurriedly left the room. The next day, he failed to appear at any of the ceremonies. His servants reported that the sovereign did not wish to see anyone, and the doors to his chambers remained closed all day. From that moment on, it became common practice in the palace to discuss the king only in whispers, for fear of inadvertently offending the man who, until recently, had been considered a symbol of the country's future stability. Anyone who saw Edward during this period noted that he had become a shadow of his former self. He didn't speak even to his closest friends, didn't go for walks in the garden, didn't take part in games, and showed no joy or interest in life. Any attempts to speak to him were met with cold silence or a distant gaze. Even the courtiers, the king's beloved dogs, sniffed him, sensing something was wrong. At the end of January 1552, after another severe attack, the chroniclers wrote, "The emperor refused food, could not speak, and was suffering from fever and exhaustion. The council decided to invite the best physicians from Cambridge and Oxford, but Agnes denied their access, citing the king's fatigue." This was the final warning sign. From that moment on, Edward was effectively isolated, and any attempts to interfere with the internal affairs of his upbringing and treatment were brutally suppressed. So slowly, day by day, the king transformed from a bright and promising youth into a hunted, silent prisoner of his own fears and the will of others. The symptoms of the disease worsened. His body and mind weakly resisted the decaying oral cavity, and the court sank deeper into an atmosphere of fear and silence, daring neither to help nor to speak the truth. In early March 1552, the court was gripped by genuine panic. The first weeks of spring had revealed to all those close to him the catastrophic state of the young monarch. The illness, long concealed and excused as adolescent changes, now left no doubt. Something beyond the usual ailments of youth was afoot. In March 1552, everyone who came into contact with Edward noted a horrific change in his appearance. His cheeks had sunken, his skin had acquired a dull, almost gray hue, his lips were cracked, and deep shadows had formed under his eyes. Most frightening was the change in his tongue. It had swelled in size, bleeding ulcers had appeared along the edges, and the center was covered with yellow and gray spots of decay. Edward kept his mouth closed almost constantly, trying not to utter a word, only occasionally gulping painfully and looking away. Servants noted that the young man had even stopped faking a smile, which had previously been considered obligatory for members of the dynasty. In early April 1552, the king stopped attending even the most essential gatherings and ceremonies. At state receptions, his place remained symbolically occupied. A coat of arms lay on the throne, and his presence was announced with pre-recorded phrases. No one dared break the silence or demand an explanation. Fear of Agnes's power was so great that even advisors and senior courtiers preferred to pretend the king's illness was merely a temporary weakness. Edward himself remained confined to his chambers for entire days, rarely even venturing into the adjoining garden, refusing to eat in the presence of servants, and the remains of food often remained untouched on the tray. In April, a few days after Easter, Edward's condition became critical. His temperature hovered above 39 degrees Celsius, his forehead was covered in sweat, and his breath smelled like a mixture of putrefaction and medication. Courtiers noticed the king had begun to have uncontrollable coughing fits, leaving traces of ichor and pus on his handkerchief. His clothes were often soiled, even after brief walks through the halls. Doctors who had even a glimpse of Edward later wrote in their notes that they had never before encountered such rapid tissue deterioration in such a young man. May 1552 marked a turning point. The disease had affected not only his mouth, but also his respiratory tract. Servants noted that the king's breathing had become ragged, and with each passing day it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to take even a single deep breath. The skin of his neck and chin had taken on a grayish-greenish tint, and swellings were appearing. Edward refused examinations, turning away irritably and limiting his interactions with others as much as possible. The change in the king's surroundings was particularly noticeable by June 1552. Servants wore special masks, curtains in all rooms were constantly drawn, and windows were opened only for a few minutes a day for ventilation. Rumors began to circulate in the castle that the monarch's body was decaying from within. Guests arriving from neighboring lands never saw the young king. They were given prepared apologies and excuses. Many began to fear even approaching his chambers. The foul odor was so strong that it could be smelled several doors away. By this point, Agnes's role had grown to one of absolute control. She determined not only who could approach Edward and when, but also what information was leaked outside the palace. All reports on the king's health were carefully filtered, and any attempts to convey real information were punished. No one knew what exactly was going on in the king's chambers. Only rare notes or fragmentary rumors reached the shadowy advisors. By mid-June, Edward's behavior began to show signs of increasing anxiety. He would often flinch at every loud noise, fidget awkwardly, and try to keep as far away from people as possible. His movements became sluggish, his reactions slow. When servants entered with yet another tray or letter, the king remained unresponsive. His gaze was absent-minded. His hands rested limply in his lap. Only on rare occasions did he display any lingering willpower. He would clutch a blood-stained handkerchief in his fingers. By August 1st, 1552, the young man's condition had become so severe that he completely lost the ability to eat or drink independently. Any attempt to swallow food was accompanied by excruciating cramps and pain. The destroyed tissues of his mouth refused to accept even liquids. The doctors, who were finally admitted at the council's insistence, merely shrugged their shoulders, officially acknowledging that the illness had progressed too far for any help. Their notes from August 5th of that year recorded, "The young sovereign is emaciated. Signs of tissue decay are evident. Breathing is shallow, speech is slurred, consciousness is clouded." Around this time, Agnes herself disappeared. Her name no longer appears in any reports or dispatches. For those around her, her sudden disappearance became as much of a mystery as her former power. Some servants later claimed that Agnes had been secretly spirited out of the castle at night, while others insisted she had left voluntarily to avoid responsibility for what had happened. Officially, the councillors avoided mentioning her name, fearing unnecessary rumors and suspicion. Meanwhile, Edward found himself completely isolated. His bed was moved to the farthest corner of the chambers, and the windows and doors were kept closed at all times. The room was kept dimly lit to minimize the noticeable changes in his appearance. The king's only means of communication were short, disjointed notes, which he attempted to leave for servants and advisors. Most of them were illegible, uneven letters, fragmentary words, sometimes mere scribbles or repeated meaningless signs. By the end of August 1552, the situation had become critical. Doctors noted not only the complete disintegration of the oral tissue, but also deep trophic ulcers in other parts of the body, caused by inactivity and exhaustion. The king could barely roll over, and his skin was covered in blotches and wounds that took weeks to heal. A heavy Swedish putrid odor emanated from the room, impossible to conceal even with strong incense and frequent ventilation. In his chambers cut off from the world, the king practically lost touch with reality. He no longer responded to outside sounds. His gaze was clouded, often staring at a single point. The physical suffering intensified. His skin became grayish and dull, his muscles flabby, and his entire figure transformed into the painfully thin, emaciated body of a teenager. Blood vessels showed through the thinned skin. His neck looked disproportionately thin, and his face was covered in blotches and ulcers. At the end of October 1552, chroniclers noted, "Royal authority is practically nominal. His Majesty's health is a matter of concern. The council acts independently." Thus ended Edward VI's final autumn, completely isolated, helpless, and fearful, under the control of people for whom his fate had become merely a formality on the road to political survival. By this time, Edward VI was almost completely paralyzed. The adolescent's body was a mere shadow of what he had been seen in portraits a year earlier. His skin was stretched taut over his bones. Deep bruises and blemishes appeared on his face and neck, and his cheeks were sunken. His eyes had lost their former luster and were constantly half-closed. His movements slow, sometimes jerky. Inside his mouth, complete disintegration reigned. The remnants of his tongue were coated in a thick film, pus oozed from wounds, and the tissue of his gums and palate had deteriorated to such an extent that even liquid food caused attacks of pain and suffocation. By the end of January 1553, Edward had practically stopped eating. Even water would not stay down, immediately triggering spasms. Doctors admitted to the king's chambers noted severe shortness of breath and a persistently high fever. His heart was beating irregularly. His skin was clammy, cold to the touch, and covered in fine beads of sweat. Servants attending the dying monarch recorded that he sometimes tossed and turned in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but more often he lay motionless, staring at the ceiling. The cries and groans emanating from his room became less frequent. He lacked the strength even to express his suffering. In early February 1553, the council finally banned all visits to the king. The last weeks of his life were spent in the strictest isolation. No one but a couple of orderlies and the senior physician saw him up close. The chronicles of these days are laconic. His condition is extremely grave. His body is completely exhausted. His end is expected soon. All state affairs were frozen during this time or transferred to trusted individuals of the council. On February 3, 1553, an official report was drawn up. His Majesty Edward VI is dying. All attempts at treatment have been abandoned. That same day, the teenager's life finally failed. His breathing became labored. His lips turned blue, and at midnight, servants recorded cardiac arrest. Only 2 court physicians and the senior valet witnessed his death. The funeral was held the following day, February 4, 1553. The ceremony was held in strict secrecy. Without the traditional public farewell, the coffin was closed, and the body was laid in a simple shroud, eschewing any pompous ceremony. Guards blocked all entrances to the castle, and only a brief official announcement was given to a few close associates. The emperor died of a long and serious illness. Official documents did not specify the exact cause of death or details of the illness. All information about the oral cavity, tissue damage, and personal circumstances of the death were expunged from the archives. Even Agnes's name was never mentioned again. Her role and involvement in Edward's life were erased from all records. The council immediately began the process of transferring power. Within days, a group of Lords Pretenders convened to discuss the succession. Most courtiers accepted the death of the young monarch as an inevitable step in English history. Few dared to speak out loud about how tragic, shameful, and painful his end had been. In subsequent years, chronicles and official records carefully avoided this chapter of history. Later sources contained only general statements. Edward VI died young, struck by a strange illness that caused exhaustion and death. However, unofficial accounts, preserved in personal diaries and correspondence, preserved details, fear, decay, physical suffering, and most importantly, the deafening, total silence of the entire court. Only centuries later did historians begin to rethink this episode as a horrific example of how systemic violence, indifference, and the desire to conceal the truth can destroy not only an individual, but an entire dynasty. The story of Edward VI remains a silent reproach to all who chose silence over action and allowed the child king to perish alone, shrouded in shame, pain, and hopelessness.